Excellent. Well, thanks for having me back. I'll try to be brief. I have quite a few slides. But, I won't talk too much about each one. Otherwise, we'll be here until sometime. All right. So, the impact of Moses on Western law and literature. That's the topic that Professor Sean gave me. So, let's start from the very beginning. So, who was Moses? So, anyone familiar with the name Moses? Anyone know about him? Yes? Anyone watched The Prince of Egypt as a cartoon from a long time ago? Anyway, so let's talk about Moses. Well, I think you've already looked at the creation, right? You looked at Adam and Eve, was it a few weeks ago? So in the beginning, God created the world and created everything perfect. Everything was beautiful, and there was Adam and there was Eve. But they decided to disobey God and ate from the forbidden tree. And what happened after that? Then there started to be fighting, murder, hatred, envy, all kinds of sin and evil came into this world as a result of humankind disobeying God and his perfect law. Then God decided that he would do something. And the way in which he enacted his plan was by choosing one man called Abraham. Have you already seen or talked about Abraham in this class? Well, so who's Abraham? Well, Abraham's the father of the Jewish people, but he's also considered to be one of the great leaders for Christians and for Muslims as well. So in fact, he's essentially considered to be the spiritual father of three of the main religions in the world: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So God called Abraham and gave him a promise, said that you would have many descendants and also you would be a blessing to all nations. Abraham then had a son called Isaac, who had a son called Joseph. Joseph, he was one of the youngest of Isaac's 12 sons, and he was hated by his older brothers because his father treated him differently, gave him a really nice cloak, treated him better than all the other children. And so they hated him, and so in the end they decided to get rid of him. They did so by throwing him down this well, and eventually selling him to slaves who went to Egypt. But when he was in Egypt, even though he started off as a slave, he ended up becoming the second in command of the whole Egypt. I mean, it's a long story, so I won't go into it. That's not the story for today. But essentially, God took Joseph to Egypt in order to put him there so that then he could save his family, who then ended up going to Egypt during a great famine. But hundreds of years later, then a new pharaoh came on the stage, and because by this time, then Joseph and his family had many generations and had multiplied. In fact, there are probably 1 million Jews by that time, or Israelites. And so Pharaoh decided that these Israelites were a threat. So he decided that he would make them all slaves. So that's how the Israelites, or how the Hebrews, ended up being slaves in Egypt. But they continued to multiply. And so Pharaoh felt that, well, if there are too many Hebrews, then they might mutiny. They might rise up and rebel against him and his power. And so they decided that, well, we have too many Hebrew boys, we'll have to get rid of them. So he made a law that said that if a Hebrew gives birth to a girl, then she may live. If she gives birth to a boy, then the boy has to be killed. And so many Hebrew boys ended up being killed as a result of the law that was given. However, there was this one mother who decided that she did not want to obey the Pharaoh's law, and so she hid her baby boy, whom she, at that time was 3 months old, from the Egyptian authorities. But then, as the boy got bigger, she could not hide him any longer, and so decided to make this reed-like cot and put him on the Nile River, and hope that God would look after the baby boy. What happens next is the baby boy is discovered by the princess, Pharaoh's daughter. And then she sees this little baby boy and thinks, wow, it must be one of the Hebrew boys, because the mother didn't want to kill the boy, and so therefore tried to save him. And so she adopts the baby as her own son and calls him Moses, which means taken out of the river. And so that's how baby Moses ended up being the adopted son of the daughter of Pharaoh. Moses, then is adopted, and when he's 40 years old, he's already lived in Egypt and being educated according to Egyptian customs, but he knows that he's a Hebrew. And so one day he decides to go and visit his own people, and then he discovers that his people are being abused. They are being beaten. They are slaves under the Egyptians. And he's very angry. So what does he do? He goes and kills the Egyptian who is abusing the Hebrew. But then Pharaoh finds out about it and feels that Moses is a threat, because Moses will probably lead a rebellion against him and let the Hebrews rise up against his power. So he decides to arrest Moses. Moses runs away and he escapes into the wilderness. And for the next 40 years, he lives in the wilderness as a shepherd. So then, by this time, he is 80 years old. And you wouldn't imagine an 80-year-old man to really be about to change the world. But what happens next is that he sees this bush, and this bush is on fire, but it doesn't burn up. And so he thinks, this is really strange. What is actually happening? Why is this bush not burning? And then all of a sudden, he hears a voice through the bush. And the voice says, take off your shoes because you are standing on holy ground. He does so. So he reckons that it must be God who is speaking to him. And then the voice says to him, I want you to save my people, the Hebrews, and take them out of Egypt. Moses says, well, who am I? I can't do that. How do I have the power to rescue the Hebrew people from Egypt? And then the voice in the bush, who is God, says to him, I'll be with you. And so he gives him certain signs, and then in the end, Moses says yes, even though he doesn't want to. So Moses, with the help of his older brother Aaron, who becomes the main spokesperson because he's better at speaking, then confronts Pharaoh and says, let our people go out and worship Yahweh, our God. But then Pharaoh thinks it's not a good idea. He said, why should I allow you to leave my country? Why should I allow you to go free? So he says no. So he makes life even more difficult for the Hebrew people. Moses then says, well, if you don't allow my people to go, then God will bring 10 plagues, 10 punishments upon the land of Egypt. And the first plague will be he will turn the water of the Nile into blood. And that is what happened. And so soon the Nile River, instead of being water, became blood, and so it could no longer be drunk. Then the next plague is that there were frogs everywhere. Throughout the land of Egypt, everywhere was covered with frogs. Then after that, God sent flies. So everywhere, then people were covered with flies, and it really just made life very difficult for everyone. The next plague was gnats. So gnats, they are even more uncomfortable because they sting you. And so everything was covered in gnats. So after a while, then the Egyptians were saying, what is happening? God is punishing us. Why don't we just allow the Hebrew people to go? And then Pharaoh was like, okay, that's a good idea. And so he calls Moses and says, okay, I'll let your people go. Just pray for me. But then Moses prays, and then these flies, these frogs, these gnats, they disappear. But then Pharaoh decides, no, I don't want to allow you to go. And the next plague is that the livestock die. And so throughout Egypt, the livestock that belongs to the Egyptians die. But the livestock that belong to the Hebrews, they live. And so God distinguishes between the two. And so throughout Egypt, then there's this huge loss, of possessions. And then there are locusts. God sends a plague of locusts, and the locusts then eat everything as in the land of Egypt. Actually, only in the part where the Egyptians are. Where the Hebrews are, there are no locusts. And so for the Egyptians, it's pretty clear that this must be a divine punishment. Otherwise, why would there be a difference between the Egyptians and the Hebrews? Then the next plague is darkness. And so Moses tells Pharaoh that for 3 days there will be no light. And that happened. And so throughout the land of Egypt, there was no light for 3 days. And Pharaoh's like, okay, I surrender, I will let your people go. Just pray that the darkness will pass. And then Moses prays, and then there's light. And once again, Pharaoh says, actually, I've changed my mind. I don't want you to go. So then there's the final plague. There's a 10th plague. And the 10th plague is the worst one. It's the death of the firstborn of every family. And God tells the Hebrews, says, you must sacrifice a lamb. Because by sacrificing a lamb, then that way I won't kill the firstborn of your family. But once you sacrifice the lamb, then you cover the doorposts with the blood of the lamb. And at night, the angel of death will pass by every household. And if the angel sees that there's blood covering the doorposts, then the angel of death will not go into that family. However, any house which does not have blood covering the doorposts, the angel of death will enter in and kill the firstborn son of that family. And so what happens? The Hebrews, they obey. And so they kill a lamb, put the blood on the doorposts, and then they are safe. But the Egyptians do not do that. Well, actually, then there's the Passover dinner. It's essentially their last meal that they have in Egypt. But in the Egyptians, because they don't do that, and so therefore, in every household, the firstborn son is dead. And there's crying throughout Egypt, and even Pharaoh's son is dead. And so Pharaoh tells Moses, says, that's it, go. I do not want to see you ever again. Because by this time, he is terrified. He is afraid that if he continues to fight against God, the entire land of Egypt will be destroyed. So, the Israelites are allowed to leave. And so they start traveling. They start walking long distance, out of the land of Egypt. But then, after a while, Pharaoh decides that, why did I allow my slaves to go? Because the Hebrews, they were probably about 1 million of them. Perhaps half of them were all slaves. So can you imagine like a few 100,000 slaves that built the pyramids? And now this labor force has left. What are we going to do, right? And so he changes his mind. He says, actually, I don't want my slaves to leave. I want them to come back. And so he starts pursuing them. You see them in the distance. The Pharaoh and his army start pursuing the Hebrews to try and bring them back to Egypt. And so the Hebrews are really afraid at this point and wondering what are we going to do, because soon the Egyptian army, which is the most powerful army in the world at that time, is going to take over. Moses prays to God and asks God what he should do in this situation, because in front of them is a Red Sea, which they cannot cross. Behind them is the Egyptian army. So what are they going to do in this situation? What happens is that God then parts the Red Sea. So the Hebrews are able to walk across the Red Sea, because at this point then the waters, they stop in the middle. But then as the Egyptians try to come through the Red Sea as well, then once again the waters, they cover the land, and so the Egyptian army is completely destroyed. So finally, then the Hebrews are free, because now there's no Egyptian army that is going to take them back to Egypt. So this is how the Hebrews were able to be free of their captivity in the land of Egypt. And it's the greatest story of deliverance and freedom in history. Then the Hebrew people, they walk several days, and eventually they reach to the Mount Sinai. And so this is Mount Sinai. And what is significant about this mountain? Because it's on this mountain that God gives the law. And so here you see God giving the 10 commandments to Moses. Commandments like, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false witness, honor your father and your mother. And so these are the basis of the laws that was given to the Hebrew people. And that's what we'll be talking about. But then, the Hebrew people, they still disobey God, and so many things happen, which I won't go into detail. But then what happens next is that they spend 40 years in the wilderness just wandering around. And during this time, Moses, he also makes a big mistake as well. And so God then tells Moses that you will not enter into the promised land. The promised land is the land of Israel, which is where the Hebrews are today. And so God then raises up another leader called Joshua, who will be the one who will take over from Moses and lead the Hebrews into the promised land. And so this is the final words that Moses gives to the people before he dies. And then just before Moses dies, by this time he's 120 years old, then God allows him to see the promised land, the land of Israel, that God is going to give to the Hebrews, or to the Israelites. And then after seeing the land, Moses never enters in, then God then takes Moses away. All right, so that's the story of Moses. And now we're looking at Moses and the Western law and politics. Or why is Moses important as far as Western law and politics is concerned? So, why is the Mosaic law important? Because he influenced the Western legal and political systems. Because if you look at the way in which the Western legal and political system is structured, you'll see that actually it does bear significant resemblance to the Mosaic law and the way in which Moses led the people. Ideas from the Mosaic law, or the law of Moses, can be seen in many of the modern laws and government in the West today. And not just in the West, because we know that Western law has also influenced many parts of the world as well, including where? Taiwan. Because Taiwanese law is based on continental law, which is actually influenced by the Mosaic law. So, what is the Mosaic law? Well, it's ultimately based on the Ten Commandments, which I already mentioned, but also on many other rules that were given to Israel. You'll see that in the Bible, especially in the book of Leviticus. It's a book that has many laws. And so for most people, it's quite boring, because for most people, law is boring. That's why lawyers have to spend their time reading lots of boring laws. That's why my wife decided that even though she studied at law school, she would not be a lawyer and she would marry me instead. Okay, and become a housewife. And because changing nappies is much more interesting than studying law. All right. So, 10 Commandments, I mentioned already, things like no stealing, no murder, no false testimony in Exodus 20. But how did this influence Western law? How did it influence Western law? Well, many of the Western laws themselves are, in fact, almost identical to the 10 Commandments. Like you shall not murder, you shall not bear false testimony in law courts. The early legal codes, such as English common law, so the earliest law in England was very much based upon the Mosaic law. And then there was also what's called canon law. What canon law is the law within the church. And so within the church itself, there was this law which then influenced the way in which law was practiced outside of church, in society as well. Because in the universities, then you had those who were training to become priests in the church, who would study church law, which is what canon law is, and they would study alongside others who were training to be government officials or lawyers within the civil sector as well. So there's a lot of influence on both sides. Laws to protect moral values and social order, that's what you see in the Bible. So if you read the first few books of the Bible, you'll see that there are a lot of laws, and those laws, then even though they might be not particularly interesting, then actually were very influential in development of Western law. So, question, what is the rule of law? And this is what the fundamental principle that we see in the Bible. The idea is that laws apply to everyone, even leaders. And that is what is most unique about the Mosaic law. Because if you compare the Mosaic law to other laws of the time, you'll see two differences. Difference number one, every other law code, the king, the emperor, the monarch, decides what a law is, right? But is the king above the law or under the law? The king is above the law. Why? Because the king is the one who gives the law, right? And so the king is the law in every other civilization, including in China. Right? The emperor is above the law. The emperor is law. But what you see in the Mosaic law is the exact opposite. Moses was up below, under the law. Why? Because God gave the law. So that's where you see the difference. So because for Moses, if he disobeyed God's law, he would be punished, and he was punished. But then in ancient Babylon, in ancient Assyria, in ancient Persia, in ancient Egypt, in ancient China, if the emperor or the king disobeys his own law, what happens? Who cares? No one's going to punish the emperor or the king or the pharaoh. That's the biggest difference, number one. Number two difference. In every other law code, what you see, there are different sets of laws. Some apply to the nobility, the upper classes. And then there's another set of laws that apply to the common people. So if you are of the nobility, if you are a prince, if you are noble, if you are rich and powerful, if you kill someone, what's going to happen? You just have to pay a fine. But if you're of the lower class, if you're poor, if you don't have power, if you kill someone, what's going to happen? You'll be killed. So it's completely different. There are two different sets of law. Mosaic law, there's one set of law. It's the same for everyone. And so it's the same whether you are the king or whether you are a slave. So Moses was under God's law, not above it. That's the biggest two differences that you see in the Mosaic law. And that is why the Western legal system is so different from the traditional Chinese system, and actually any other system as well. Protecting the weak in society. The Mosaic law defended the poor, the widows, and the orphans, and that is one of the most important differences. Roman law, Greek law is all about protecting what? Protecting the rights of the king, protecting the rights of the emperor, protecting the rights of those who had property, the wealthy, the powerful. But the Mosaic law was about defending the rights of the poor, the widows, the orphans, those who would be exploited, those who did not have power. And that then has influenced modern human rights laws. So why is it that even today, like in Taiwan, we see the poor, the widows, the orphans still as having rights? That's not from Roman law, that's not from Greek law, that's not from Persian law. It's all based on the Mosaic law. That however weak or poor you are, you still have basic rights which have to be respected. Moses' influence on political thought. So Moses, he appointed judges to help him govern. This is kind of similar to modern governments where the power is divided. There's the executive, legislative, and the judicial branches. But even more important than this part is the whole idea of covenant. So Moses led the people under a covenant agreement with God. So there's this written covenant between God and the people. And that covenant has to be obeyed. No one can go against that agreement between God and the Israelites. Early American leaders, when they founded America, they took that idea of a written covenant, which is the Mosaic law, and they used it as a basis for the American Constitution. And so that's why in America there's this thing called a Constitution. And every law has to be based upon the Constitution. And that then has influenced governments throughout the world, including in Taiwan as well. So in Taiwan there's a Constitution, and so laws can't go against the Constitution. But where does this idea of a Constitution come from? It's based upon the covenant that God made with Moses. All right, Moses and the fight for freedom. Moses and the fight for freedom. So, U.S. independence. In 1776, the American people, they declared independence from Britain. And in the Declaration of Independence, it states, all people are equal and have rights. Well, that's kind of a summary. Where did they get the idea of all people being equal and having rights? From Exodus, in which even the slaves in Egypt, the Israelites, God saw as being important, and God protected, and God rescued them. And so the American colonies, they wanted freedom from a British rule. And they actually saw in the Bible a parallel. They saw that in the same way that Moses and the Israelites in Egypt wanted freedom from Pharaoh, that they as Americans, they wanted freedom from the British. Then American slavery. So even though now the American white colonial people, they are now free, but the black slaves, they are not. But what's interesting is that many of those who were taken as slaves over to America, they then heard about Moses. And so they began to sing songs that very much reflected what they heard about Moses in the Bible. And so one of the famous songs that they sang, the African slaves, was Go Down Moses. And one of the key verses is Let My People Go. So these black slaves in America, then they were singing about Moses, about the story in the Bible, and they were actually doing so as a prayer that they too might become free. So because they saw Moses as a symbol of freedom from oppression, and eventually, that led to their freedom. Then by 1960s, then with Martin Luther King and the civil rights, then Martin Luther King Jr., or MLK, he led protests for equal rights for black Americans, because even by the 1960s, then blacks had fewer rights than whites. You know, blacks had to sit at the back of the bus. Blacks could not attend certain schools. You know, blacks could not intermarry with whites. You know, blacks just didn't have basic rights that the white people had. And what did MLK in his speeches, what did he repeatedly mention? This is one of the lines from his speech. I might not reach the promised land, but we will get there. Promised land, reference to Israel. So he compared himself to Moses, saying that even though he might not actually enter into the promised land, he believed that eventually that God would deliver the black people, that they would be able to have equal rights with whites. So like Moses, he fought against the unfair laws peacefully. Here's Martin Luther King, and actually history tells us that he never reached that promised land. Why? Because he was killed, he was assassinated, you know, before the laws were finally passed. Ah, he's disappeared. Okay. All right, then Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, who fought against apartheid in South Africa. So Mandela, he was born into privilege, he was well educated, but he chose to fight for justice. And he challenged the unjust ruler or rulers of the time. So at that time then in South Africa, there was what's called apartheid. And so similar to America in the 1960s, then the blacks did not have the same rights as the whites in South Africa. You know, they were limited in terms of where they could live. Much of the land belonged to the whites, and so the blacks were living in poverty. So Mandela decided that no, this is unfair. So he sought to fight against the injustice. And just like Moses, he spent time, you know, in exile or in prison. For Moses, he spent 40 years in the wilderness. For Mandela, he spent 27 years in prison before leading his people. And eventually he led South Africa to become a democracy, to become truly free and equal. So here's Nelson Mandela, one of the great leaders of the South African peoples, and who completely changed history in a very similar way to Moses. In fact, he found much inspiration from Moses there as well. And then there's Mahatma Gandhi. In his case, then, he was leading India's independence, and he also was fighting against oppression. So just like Moses fought against the oppression under Pharaoh and the Egyptian Empire, then Gandhi fought against the oppression of the British Empire. And in the same way that Moses used non-violence resistance, right? Moses didn't call the Israelites to take up arms, take your knives and kill the Egyptians. No. Instead, he trusted God to bring deliverance. And so the same way, Gandhi then used non-violence resistance against the British Empire. And in the same way, he won. And so he was able to lead the people on a long journey to freedom. So it took many, many years. It took several decades before finally India gained independence from British rule. In the same way that it took many years for Moses to lead the people out of Egypt and then finally into the Promised Land. So there's Gandhi, the father of modern India, just as – Moses became the father of Israel. So, which question, well, you can think about this yourself. Which leader do you find most inspiring? So I mentioned a few. So obviously there's Moses, but then in modern day there's Martin Luther King Jr., there's Nelson Mandela, and there's also Mahatma Gandhi. So which one are you more familiar with? Or which one do you find most inspiring in terms of what they did? And have you ever seen someone stand up for justice in your own community? Have you seen anyone who is like Martin Luther King Jr. or like Nelson Mandela standing up against injustice even though they don't have to? And if you could change one unfair rule or law in the world, what would it be? So this is just for you to think about. You can discuss later on, I think, during the break, if you like. But let me quickly continue to Moses as a hero in stories. So Moses didn't just inspire people in history to fight for freedom and to fight for justice, but he also inspired many stories, even fairly modern ones. Moses kind of embodied this Moses pattern. So there's three parts to it. The first part is a chosen leader. This person is chosen, someone called for a special mission. They might be a very ordinary person, but then somehow they're called to do this special task. Second stage, they face a powerful villain. There has to be a very powerful bad guy, all right? A ruler or an enemy who must be defeated. Otherwise there's no story. And then number three is that this chosen leader then leads his or her people to freedom. So the hero fights to save others and eventually change the world. So this is what Moses did, and it is also the same pattern that we see in many of the superheroes in film or in literature. For example, The Lord of the Rings. How many of you have watched the movies, The Lord of the Rings, or you've read the books? Yeah, anyone? None of you? This was a series that came out actually about over 10 years ago. But I'll definitely recommend watching. There's 3 movies, and they're pretty well done. But let me tell you the story of Lord of the Rings. So the first part, there's a call to adventure, kind of like the Moses and the burning bush. Right? So there's this hobbit called Frodo. So what are hobbits? They are very, very short, maybe like this tall. Not dwarves, because dwarves are very strong. So even dwarves are short, but they are strong. Hobbits aren't. Hobbits are just small, right? They are very peaceful, they are very fun-loving, and so not powerful at all. And so this small hobbit inherits this one ring. And this one ring is very, very powerful. It's very magical. And Gandalf is a wizard. So in the last part, so this is Frodo. He's this small hobbit, and this is Gandalf, who is this really wise and powerful wizard. And so Gandalf, the wizard, calls Frodo onto this mission. And his mission is, you must destroy the ring. You must take it back to where it was, and there you can destroy it. And then Frodo is like, I'm just like a small hobbit. How can I accomplish this mission? He thinks, no, there's no way I can do it. Why don't you do it? But Gandalf's like, no, you were the one who was chosen to accomplish this mission. Second part, confronting the enemy. So much like Moses confronting Pharaoh. So Sauron, he's the most powerful being in the world at that time. No one can defeat him. And he's kind of like Pharaoh. And he wants to rule over the world, what at that point is called Middle-earth. Frodo is the one who's been chosen. He must defeat Sauron. But how can a little hobbit defeat the most powerful being in the world at that time? Well, he has help from Gandalf, who's a wizard, Sam, who's his friend, and others, including mighty warriors as well. All right, I'll just finish this story and then we'll have a break, okay? So then there's the journey through hardships, much like the Israelites in the wilderness. So Frodo with his friends, he struggles under the burden of his ring. So he has this magical ring, but his magical ring gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and it's really hard for him to carry it. Just like Moses was carrying the burden of leading his people. Then for the final battle and the fall of the enemy, much like the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army, where Pharaoh's eventually destroyed. So in the story, Lord of the Rings, the ring is destroyed, and that then leads to Sauron's defeat. So the Hobbit, Frodo, he manages to take the ring to this mountain, like this volcano, where the ring was first made, throws the ring into the volcano, and it's destroyed. And as a result, Middle-earth is saved, just like Moses led the Israelites to freedom. Last part, Frodo's departure. Much like Moses not entering the promised land. So Frodo, in the process of destroying the ring, he's hurt. And so because he's hurt, then it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so in the end, he's taken to what's called the Undying Lands. It's this magical land where elves go to, where you live forever. And so Frodo then leaves Middle-earth. So even though he's the hero of the story, in the end he leaves. And instead, then it's others like Aragorn and Sam who become like the main leaders in Middle-earth. A bit like Moses not entering into the promised land. So that's Lord of the Rings. We will continue for a few more minutes after the break. All right, wait, let's have a 10-minute break. All right, Harry Potter. So everyone watched or read Harry Potter? At least a few more nods. Excellent. At least you're more familiar with Harry Potter. So Harry Potter is also similar to Moses, or actually the whole story is very much the same as the Moses model. So number one, the threat at birth. So like Moses in Egypt. So when Moses was a baby, then Pharaoh wanted to kill him, or there was a law that required that you must kill all baby boys. Voldemort tries to kill baby Harry. So if you're familiar with Harry Potter, you know that Voldemort is this evil wizard, and because there's this prophecy that Harry will one day kill or defeat Voldemort, and so therefore Voldemort tries to kill baby Harry when he's very young. But both Moses and Harry manage to survive, and they are taken away in safety. So just as Moses is placed in a basket and put along the Nile River, then Harry is sent to live with his uncle, the Dursleys, and away from the magical world. And second, the Court of Destiny, much like Moses at the burning bush. So Moses is called by God through the burning bush, and the same way that Harry is called by the magical world through the Hogwarts and through Dumbledore. However, Moses, initially he refuses. He's like, I cannot do such a great task. And Harry is also filled with self-doubt and tries to argue that he's not the one to be finishing such a task. Number three, fighting against the oppressor. Much like Moses versus Pharaoh. So just like Moses fights against Pharaoh through the 10 plagues, then Harry, he challenges Voldemort. And Voldemort, he tries to seek control over the entire magical world, but then Harry is the one who prevents him from doing so. And in both cases, they perform magic. So Moses, he has the 10 plagues. Harry, then he learns magic and through magic he fights against Voldemort. Number 4, leading others to freedom, like Exodus' story. So Moses, he leads the Israelites out of Egypt and away from the power of Pharaoh. So in the same way, then Harry, he leads Dumbledore's army. He trains all these other students in order to fight against Voldemort and his powerful allies, and forms the Order of the Phoenix. He becomes the leader who teaches others and trains others to fight for justice. Then the final battle and victory, much like the Red Sea and Pharaoh's defeat. So just like Moses watches Pharaoh's army collapse, as they try to go through the Red Sea and the Red Sea destroys them, then Harry, he faces Voldemort in the final battle of the Hogwarts, which is where Voldemort is finally destroyed. And in both cases, then the evil side loses partially because of their own arrogance and pride. But then there's the last part, a new beginning. Like Moses not entering the promised land. So just like Moses, he doesn't enter into the promised land, but passes the leadership on to Joshua, then Harry, after defeating Voldemort, he actually steps back and he lets others take the lead. So in both cases, then, it's others who finally continue what they themselves have started. So that's Harry Potter. But then there's a third story, Superman. I'm sure you all are familiar with Superman, or at least watch one of the movies at some point. So Superman is also a Moses type. Firstly, a baby sent away to escape death, much like Moses in the Nile. So just like Moses is placed in a basket and sent away, then Superman's parents, they send him away from planet Krypton in a spaceship in order to save his life. Then adopted and raised by others, just like Moses in Pharaoh's palace. So just like Moses is raised by Pharaoh's daughter, then Superman is discovered as a baby by Jonathan and Martha Kent, and they raised him in Smallville, Kansas. So he's raised to be just like any other human being, even though he's not actually from outer space. And so both of them grew up in a setting which is very different from their origins, learning about their true identity over time. Then, thirdly, Superman becomes a leader and savior for the oppressed. So, in the same way that Moses, he led the Israelites into freedom, Superman, he protects humanity from evil, fighting against injustice. So both become symbols of hope and justice for those who cannot fight for themselves. Finally, why do we love these stories? Well, we see the same Moses pattern appear in books, in movies, and including history itself. Heroes stand up to injustice, because when we are faced with injustice, then we cry out for someone to save us. And it is these Moses types, whether it's Moses himself, or whether it's Martin Luther King Jr., or whether it's Superman, who are the ones who come and deliver us, who fight against evil and injustice and lead us into freedom. And we are real leaders. I mentioned King, there's also Gandhi, there's also Nelson Mandela, and others as well who have followed the Moses model. So these are all stories. So some of them are real, some of them are fictional, but they all have something about them which we find attractive, because the overcoming of evil, the overcoming of injustice is something which our hearts cry out for. So starting from the Bible up until today. Right, so just a few questions for you to think about in your own time. Can you think of other heroes who follow the Moses pattern? Anyone else? Apart from Superman or Harry Potter, are there others who also follow a similar pattern? And how do you think Moses' influence can still be seen in the world today? So over 3,500 years ago, it was when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. But can we still see his influence today? And lastly, if you were a leader, what kind of laws would you create to make a fair society? If you were a leader, if you were like Moses, if you could lead a people and create a nation, what kind of laws would you create to make the nation a fair society? So those are just a few questions for you to think about. I'll give you maybe another minute to write them down if you like.
I want to ask that what kind of special personality traits did Moses have to make God feel that he was the right person to bring Israel out of Egypt?
Yeah. Okay, so the question was, what kind of characteristic traits did Moses have such that God would choose him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt? Very good question. I think there were several. So for one thing, then he was familiar with Egypt. He was familiar with the laws. He was familiar with the way in which it was governed. Because he was, after all, he was the adopted son of the daughter of Pharaoh. So you could say that he was himself born into royalty. He learned everything about Egypt. And what was important about that is that he became the father of a nation. So he was the one who had to create a nation from just slaves. So how do you lead a nation? How do you create a nation? How do you structure a nation in a way which will be fair for the people and will be effective? Well, because he lived in a palace, and so then he learned everything, at least in terms of how Egypt was structured. He learned how to govern, he learned how to lead, he learned about the laws. So at least there was that knowledge there. So he was probably one of the best educated people in Egypt at the time. So it was his education that at least gave him the ability to then lead a people. Because at that time then, there were probably over 1 million, maybe 2 million Israelites whom he had to lead. So that's one thing. Because he knew and understood Egypt, and also he knew Pharaoh, maybe he even grew up with him, and so he was the best person to negotiate. He was the best person to speak to Pharaoh, as it were. He knew the language, he probably had some relationship with him. So in that sense then, yeah, he was certainly suitable. But I think there's a third characteristic which is probably just as important as the other two that I mentioned, and that was he was humble. So it says in the Bible several times that Moses was humble. And what does that mean? That means he was not ambitious. He was not about gaining power for himself. In fact, he didn't want the power. He didn't want to lead the people. So it was his humility that made him the perfect leader. Because think about it, if he was ambitious, if he was proud, if he wanted to become great, then what kind of leader would he become? He would become a dictator. He would essentially oppress the people the same way as Pharaoh oppressed the people in the first place. So God did not want a second Pharaoh. He did not want a leader who would just take the people out of Egypt and then become a second Pharaoh and then and then exploit the people. So I think that was the third and maybe one of the most important characteristics.
那个摩西模式是后来人们统整出来的，就是作为领导者的特质。
So the Moses pattern. So Moses' pattern, it's seen in a lot of stories. So you start with one person being chosen, maybe one of you. It's like, okay, one of you is going to save Taiwan one day. So that's the first step. And then the second step is that there's this great enemy. So I don't know, maybe China decides to invade Taiwan. But then, one of you will be the one who will defend Taiwan against China. And you succeed in doing so. So, and then you lead, Taiwan to become independent, or maybe you reconquer China and liberate China instead, something. And so that is kind of like the Moses pattern. So, an ordinary person was chosen to accomplish a great task against a great enemy, and then eventually lead the people to freedom or defeat evil and injustice.
So I actually went into like a rabbit hole like yesterday, like I was reading more book on Exodus, and I read that there was like a tent, like a tabernacle or something. And so like was Moses were actually like were able to be in the tent. Or not? I mean, like the other Israelites, like are they able to go inside?
Yeah. So questions about the tabernacle that was set up, and the tabernacle was basically a tent in which God's presence would be. But then initially there was only Moses who could enter into the tabernacle. Then Aaron, his older brother, was chosen to be the high priest. And so then Aaron, as a high priest, he could also enter in. So in that sense, only those two could. And then later on, then it was Aaron's descendants, his children, grandchildren, who then took over to become priests who could also enter in.
So in the end, that Moses were able to go inside, because I heard there are some people interpret it as like Moses were not able to go inside.
Oh no, he was. Yeah, Moses and Aaron, they were specially chosen, they could. Moses wasn't able to enter into promised land. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I ask a question. If no one do, you mentioned Moses pattern. Because after next week, we will focus on American dream. So I think this going for a better place, right? For freedom or better life is also kind of a bit similar to the so-called American dream. I know you're very knowledgeable about Trump. Maybe you can talk about Trump, whether does he fit into this Moses pattern? Would he be considered as a hero to rescue or save America for a better promised place? Maybe you can talk a bit, Jan.
Yeah. So I agree. Yeah. So Donald Trump, very much fits the Moses pattern. Trump, he's an unlikely person. I mean, he's a businessman, and many people would not consider him to be a particularly spiritual. He's not a very religious person. He's not a politician initially, but then somehow he becomes chosen to become U.S. president. And there's the sense that there's some kind of divine destiny about him. And for one thing, he was shot twice, but both times he survived. So there's something seemingly divine about the way in which he has become president. And there are many in America who see him as being like Moses in bringing America back to its original glory. Because many in America feel that America is on the decline. Things are getting worse and worse. Many people, they can't find jobs or can't find the kind of jobs that they would like. Wage is stagnating, so people are getting poor. And there's a sense that America is becoming weaker and weaker in the world. And also violence crime is increasing. There's this opioid crisis. Many people are addicted to drugs. And so there's a general sense of decay in America. Just a sense that things are getting worse, not better. And so many Americans then see Trump as being divinely chosen to save America from its decline, to make America great again. So there are powerful forces that Trump is trying to fight against, and forces in America itself, forces that are considered to be against what America stands for, that are against America's traditions, and also forces like China, which is considered to be a threat to America as well. So Trump is the one who will save America from the threat of China and also from a threat within also. So in that sense then, Trump is a kind of Moses character. Whether they are right or not, I have no comment.
So there are people compare him to Moses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much have the same hopes that just as Moses saved the Israelites, that somehow Trump will save Americans.
Enough discussion. Okay, question.
In the story of Moses, why did people kill the lamb to paint its blood on the door? It's a little immoral to exchange life for life.
Are you vegetarian?
No.
Because the lamb was killed. Yeah, it was a sheep that was killed, and then the blood of the sheep was put on the doorposts. And so it's exchanging the life of a human for the life of a sheep. Yeah, so the lamb or the sheep was the one who died in the place of the human being, of the Israelite. Yeah, so in that sense, then yes, it was killing an animal in order to save the life of a human being. So would you say that's immoral? Well, in I guess in a sense, then yes, there was death, but within the culture at the time, there was this sense that there needs to be what's called atonement, or you have to sacrifice something in exchange for forgiveness. So if I've done something wrong, if I harm you, if I harm maybe one of your family members, then I would need to pay for it. Maybe I can pay by money, but then let's say I harm you physically, right? I'm riding my bicycle and I hit into you, and cause you to be cut on your face. Then in those days, then the sense is that if I cause you harm, then I need to repay. And the way in which it's repaid is often eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And so if I cut you on your face, then you cut me on my face. Someone else can do that, right? But then what happens if I kill someone? So if I kill someone, then the only way in which I can repay is by me being killed. Yeah, so eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but then 杀人偿命, right? But then what if an entire people, what if all of us, what if there's like this big war, and during this war, then thousands of people are killed. But then if we, if all of us were part of this war, if we were all part of this incident that killed like hundreds of thousands of people, then what do? How do you, balance justice? Do we say, okay, in that case, you killed these people, then you have to be killed? But then there's no end to that. If there's like two families, and these families have been at war with each other for like 20, 30 years, and both sides have killed the other side, then if you want to bring an end to it, what do you do in order to bring an end to the fighting? You can either say, okay, you killed 100 of our people, we'll kill 100 of your people. But then that might mean everyone's dead. So the way in which God did it is that, okay, I'm not going to force you all to die. The sheep can die in your place. So you've done wrong, but instead of punishing you, I'll put the punishment on the sheep. So you might feel sorry for the sheep, but do you feel sorry for the cow or the pig when you eat steak or when you enjoy sausage? Right? I guess you maybe not, right? Because if you're not vegetarian. So yeah. I mean, it seems unfair for the sheep, but come on, like at the end of the day, I'm sure you're not that sorry, for all the hamburger that you have for supper. All right. So it's just a way in which there's a sense that there needs to be payment, there needs to be sacrifice, there needs to be punishment. But instead of the human being being punished, the animal is punished instead.
有问题再问一个吧，你再问一个，我们再下课。既然你们这一组有写。
I'm sure some did. Okay, because if you read the story in Exodus, then you'll discover that when the Israelites left Egypt, some Israelites went with them. So there were a few. So I think some of the Egyptians, they saw all these Israelites doing that, right? And they probably thought to themselves, if they are doing that, we should do the same thing. Because there must be a reason why they're doing that, and it seems that their God is protecting them. So if we do the same thing as what they are doing, then probably God will protect us as well. So I think some of the Egyptians did do the same thing, and as a result, they were rescued. And probably then they decided, in that case, we should go with the Israelites. And so amongst those who left Egypt, there were some Egyptians who left Egypt as well. So that's why if all of a sudden you start seeing like lots of rats or cockroaches all running in one direction, I would suggest that you do the same thing. Because sometimes they know that there's an earthquake or something, and they start running. And so I think we should probably do follow them.